October 16, 1946, Nuremberg Prison, American-occupied Germany. A 46-year-old man walks toward the gallows, his face gaunt, his body weakened by months of imprisonment. In less than an hour, he'll be dead, hanged by the neck in a cold gymnasium converted into an execution chamber. But here's what makes this execution different from all the others that night. This man didn't just follow orders. He ruled an entire nation with absolute power. He turned Poland into a graveyard. And when you hear what he did, when you understand the scale of his crimes, you'll realize why even his fellow Nazis called him excessive. His name was Hans Frank. And before we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why his final moments were so painful, why justice demanded he suffer, and why his story represents the ultimate corruption of power. This is about what happens when an educated, cultured man discovers he can commit genocide and call it administration. And trust me, what you're about to hear will make you question how someone who loved Chopin and Shakespeare could orchestrate the murder of millions. But here's what will really disturb you. Hans Frank wasn't born evil. He was born into a respectable German family, studied law, became a brilliant attorney. So what transformed this educated lawyer into someone so brutal that he earned the title Butcher of Poland? The answer will show you how easily civilization can collapse into barbarism. May 23, 1900, Karlsruhe, Germany. Hans Michael Frank entered the world as the son of a lawyer. His father, Karl Frank, was a successful attorney. His mother came from a well-to-do family. They were educated, cultured, the kind of people who attended opera and discussed philosophy over dinner. Young Hans grew up surrounded by books and ideas. He was a brilliant student, the kind who devoured literature and excelled in debate. His teachers predicted a bright future. Perhaps a professor, certainly a lawyer like his father. He loved music, particularly Chopin. He could play the piano beautifully. He read Shakespeare in English. He wrote poetry. This wasn't some thuggish brute. This was a refined, educated young man who seemed destined for respectability. World War I changed everything. Hans was too young to fight, but he watched Germany's humiliation with burning resentment. The Treaty of Versailles, the economic collapse, the chaos of the Weimar Republic. For young Germans like Hans, it felt like their entire world had been destroyed by foreign powers and internal traitors. In 1919, at just 19 years old, Hans joined a Freikorps unit, one of the paramilitary groups fighting communists in the streets. He tasted violence for the first time and discovered something disturbing. He was good at it. He didn't flinch. He could give orders that resulted in deaths and sleep soundly afterward. But Hans was too smart to remain a street fighter. He enrolled in law school, first in Kiel, then Munich. He studied under some of Germany's finest legal minds. He absorbed constitutional law, criminal procedure, the philosophy of justice. He graduated with honors in 1926 and opened his own practice. For a few years, Hans Frank was exactly what his parents had hoped. A successful attorney, well-dressed, articulate, respected. He joined the Nazi Party in 1927, but so did lots of ambitious young Germans. It seemed like a career move, nothing more. Then he met Adolf Hitler. Hitler needed lawyers. The Nazi Party was constantly in legal trouble, arrests, lawsuits, prosecutions. Hans Frank volunteered to represent them. He was brilliant in court, turning political trials into propaganda victories. He defended Hitler personally in over 150 cases. And Hitler noticed. Here was an educated man, a lawyer who could make Nazi ideology sound reasonable, even legal. Hitler began calling Hans his personal attorney. The relationship transformed Hans completely. He wasn't just defending clients anymore. He was serving a cause. He believed Hitler was Germany's savior, and he was willing to use his legal expertise to help build the Third Reich. January 30th, 1933. Hitler became Chancellor. Hans Frank's loyalty was rewarded immediately. He was appointed Bavarian Minister of Justice. Think about that. A 32-year-old lawyer suddenly controlled the entire justice system of Germany's second-largest state. He used that power ruthlessly. He purged Jewish judges and attorneys. He created special courts that operated outside normal legal protections. He turned justice into a weapon of the state. Trials became formalities. Verdicts were predetermined. The law meant whatever Hans Frank said it meant. But this was just the beginning. In 1934, Hitler appointed him Reich Minister of Justice. Hans now controlled the legal system of the entire German Reich. He drafted the Nuremberg laws that stripped Jews of citizenship and rights. He created the legal framework for persecution. He took centuries of German legal tradition and twisted it into something monstrous. And he did it all with the precision of a trained attorney, making oppression look legal, making genocide look administrative. Other Nazi leaders were crude thugs. Hans Frank was different. He could quote Goethe while signing death warrants. He could play Chopin before ordering mass executions. This combination of culture and cruelty made him uniquely dangerous. He proved that education doesn't prevent evil. Sometimes it just makes evil more efficient. September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. The war Hans had helped prepare for legally had finally begun. Within weeks, Poland was defeated, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Hitler needed someone to govern the German portion, the general government, as it was called. He needed someone ruthless enough to crush Polish resistance, educated enough to create an administrative structure, and loyal enough to implement the final solution without question. He chose Hans Frank. October 26, 1939. Hans Frank arrived in Krakow as Governor General of occupied Poland. He was 39 years old, at the height of his power, ruling over 12 million people with absolute authority. No checks, no balances, no oversight. He was a dictator answerable only to Hitler. And he loved it. He moved into Wawel Castle, the ancient seat of Polish kings. He decorated it with stolen art, priceless paintings looted from Polish museums and private collections. He lived like royalty, hosting elaborate dinners, attending concerts, surrounding himself with luxury while the people he governed starved. But the luxury was just the surface. Underneath, Hans Frank was implementing a program of systematic destruction. His goal wasn't just to defeat Poland, it was to erase it, to kill its leaders, destroy its culture, reduce its people to slaves. He said it explicitly in a speech to his administrators. Poland shall be treated like a colony. The Poles will become the slaves of the greater German Empire. He meant every word. December 1939, just 2 months into his rule. Hans Frank issued orders for the first mass arrests of Polish intellectuals, teachers, professors, priests, doctors, lawyers, anyone who could lead resistance. They were rounded up by the thousands. Some were sent to concentration camps, others were simply shot. Hans called it extraordinary pacification action. It was the beginning of genocide. By the end of 1940, over 60,000 Polish intellectuals had been murdered. Hans Frank signed the orders from his castle, then went to dinner. But the intellectuals were just the beginning. Hans had bigger plans. In December 1941, he attended a conference in Berlin where Nazi leaders discussed the final solution, the complete extermination of European Jews. Hans returned to Poland energized. He gathered his administrators and told them plainly, "We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them." No euphemisms, no coded language, just straightforward genocide. And he had the perfect territory to do it. Poland had Europe's largest Jewish population, over 3 million people. Hans Frank controlled their fate completely. The death camps were built in his territory: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek. These weren't just camps. They were industrial murder facilities, designed to kill thousands of people per day. Hans Frank didn't personally operate the gas chambers, but he provided the administrative structure that made them possible. He signed the orders that sent trains full of Jews to their deaths. He allocated resources, personnel, supplies. He made genocide efficient. And he did it all from behind a desk, using the skills he'd learned in law school. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Under Hans Frank's rule, approximately 3 million Polish Jews were murdered. That's roughly 90% of Poland's Jewish population. Gone. Entire communities, centuries of culture, millions of individual lives, all erased. And Hans Frank was directly responsible. He created the system. He gave the orders. He made it happen. But it wasn't just Jews. Hans Frank's policies killed millions of non-Jewish Poles as well. He implemented forced labor programs that worked people to death. He confiscated food, causing mass starvation. He ordered reprisal killings, entire villages destroyed for acts of resistance. One estimate puts the total death toll under his rule at over 5 million people. 5 million. That's more than the entire population of Norway. All dead in just 5 years. And through it all, Hans Frank maintained his cultured facade. He collected art, over 800 paintings stolen from Polish collections. He attended concerts and theater performances. He kept a detailed diary, 43 volumes documenting his thoughts and actions. He wrote about his love of music, his appreciation for beauty, his philosophical reflections. Then, in the next entry, he'd casually mention ordering the execution of thousands of people. The disconnect was staggering. This was a man who could weep at a Chopin nocturne, then sign a death warrant for an entire ghetto. He saw no contradiction. In his mind, he was bringing German civilization to a barbaric land. The killing was just necessary administration. His subordinates found him terrifying. He would fly into rages over minor administrative errors, screaming and threatening. Then he'd calm down and discuss philosophy. He was unpredictable, volatile, drunk on power. He gave speeches where he openly boasted about his brutality. In one infamous address, he told his officials, "We are not here to govern Poland with justice, but to exploit it, to squeeze from it every ounce of value." He said this proudly, as if it were an achievement. By 1944, even other Nazi leaders thought Hans Frank was excessive. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, complained that Frank was too brutal, too public about the killings. Think about that. The head of the SS thought Hans Frank was too extreme. That's how far he'd gone. But Hans didn't care. He had absolute power, and he intended to use it until the very end. January 1945. The Soviet army was advancing into Poland. Hans Frank knew the end was coming. He began destroying evidence, burning documents, evacuating stolen art. But he kept his diary, all 43 volumes. Perhaps he thought they'd vindicate him someday. Perhaps he was too arrogant to imagine he'd face justice. On January 17, 1945, Hans Frank fled Krakow ahead of Soviet forces. He took his family and his stolen treasures and ran west into Germany. For months, he moved from place to place, watching the Third Reich collapse around him. The man who'd ruled millions now lived like a fugitive. May 4, 1945. American soldiers found Hans Frank hiding in a villa in Bavaria. He was using his real name. He hadn't even tried to disguise himself. When the soldiers arrived, Hans was calm. He knew who they were and why they'd come. He'd even prepared a statement. He wanted to surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets or Poles. He knew what they'd do to him. The Americans took him into custody. They found his diary, all 43 volumes carefully preserved. Hans actually seemed proud of it. He thought it proved he was an important historical figure. He didn't realize he'd documented his own crimes in meticulous detail. The Allies were planning trials for major war criminals, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Hans Frank would be one of the main defendants. The charges were crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: his own diary, testimony from survivors, documents bearing his signature. But Hans had a plan. He would defend himself. He was a lawyer, after all. He'd defended Hitler successfully. Surely he could defend himself. November 20th, 1945. The Nuremberg trials began. 22 defendants sat in the dock, the leadership of the Nazi regime. Hans Frank sat among them, thinner now, his face drawn. Prison had aged him, but he still carried himself with dignity, still believed he could talk his way out. The prosecution presented their case against him. They read from his diary, his own words condemning him. They showed photographs of mass graves, of starving children, of destroyed villages. They brought survivors who testified about the horrors of his rule. The evidence was damning beyond measure. When it was Hans Frank's turn to testify, something unexpected happened. He confessed. Not to everything, but to enough. He admitted he'd ruled Poland brutally. He admitted Jews had been killed under his authority. He claimed he'd opposed the worst excesses, that he'd tried to resign multiple times, that Hitler had refused. It was a calculated defense. Admit some guilt, claim you were trapped, appeal to the judge's mercy. But then Hans did something that shocked everyone. He converted to Catholicism, or claimed to. He met with a prison chaplain, Father Sixtus O'Connor. He confessed his sins. He took communion. He said he'd found God again after years of darkness. Was it genuine? Or was it a final manipulation, an attempt to appear repentant? The judges didn't care. The evidence was clear. Hans Frank had ruled Poland with genocidal brutality. His religious conversion didn't change the facts. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were announced. Hans Frank was found guilty on counts 3 and 4, war crimes and crimes against humanity. The tribunal found that he had implemented policies of terror, persecution, and extermination, that he bore direct responsibility for the deaths of millions. And for these crimes, he was sentenced to death by hanging. When the sentence was read, Hans Frank stood calmly. He nodded slightly, as if he'd expected it. He said nothing. Back in his cell, he told the chaplain he accepted the sentence as just punishment for his sins. He spent his final days reading the Bible, praying, writing letters to his wife and children. He wanted them to know he'd found redemption. He wanted them to remember him as a man who'd lost his way, but found God at the end. It was his final performance, the cultured man facing death with dignity. October 16, 1946, Execution Day. Hans Frank awoke at 1 a.m. He'd barely slept. The guards reported he'd spent most of the night praying. He ate a light breakfast, refused a sedative. He wanted to face death fully conscious. At 1:30 a.m., the guards came for him. It was time. 10 men would hang that night, the condemned from Nuremberg. Hans Frank would be fourth. He had to wait, listening to the others go before him. Hermann Göring had cheated the hangman, taking cyanide hours earlier. But the others went to the gallows. Hans could hear the sounds, the footsteps, the trapdoor opening. the bodies dropping. Each sound brought his own death closer. At 2:12 a.m., the guards entered his cell. "It's time, Herr Frank." Hans stood. He was wearing a black suit, freshly pressed. He'd combed his hair carefully. Even now, appearances mattered. He walked steadily between the guards, down the corridor toward the gymnasium, where the gallows waited. The walk took 3 minutes. Hans used the time to pray silently, his lips moving. He was 46 years old. In another life, he might have been a respected judge, a law professor, a man of genuine accomplishment. Instead, he was about to die as one of history's greatest mass murderers. The gymnasium was cold, lit by harsh lights. 2 gallows stood side by side, black wooden structures with trap doors and ropes. 3 men had already died on them tonight. Hans would be the 4th. Witnesses lined the walls, military officers, legal observers, journalists. They watched silently as Hans Frank entered. He looked at the gallows without expression. The guards led him up the 13 steps to the platform. His legs were steady. Whatever else Hans Frank was, he wasn't a coward. He stood on the trap door, directly over the opening. The guards moved to restrain him, but Hans spoke his last words. "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy." That was it. No apology to his victims, no acknowledgement of the millions he'd killed. Just thanks for his treatment and a prayer for his own soul. The guards secured the restraints on his hands and legs. Hans didn't resist. The black hood was placed over his head. He stood in darkness now, feeling the rope being positioned around his neck. The noose was thick, rough hemp. The knot was placed behind his left ear, the standard position. When the trap opened, the fall would snap his neck. Death would be quick. Or it should be. The executioner was Master Sergeant John Woods, an American soldier who'd volunteered for the job. He'd hanged over 300 men during the war. He knew his craft. But there were rumors that Woods had made adjustments for the Nuremberg executions, that the ropes were slightly too short, the drops calculated to cause strangulation rather than instant death, that these men would suffer just a little, just enough. Woods never confirmed or denied it. He just did his job. Hans Frank stood on the trap door, hooded and bound. His breathing was rapid now, audible in the silent gymnasium. Fear had finally broken through his composure. He was about to die, and all his education, all his culture, all his power meant nothing. The executioner checked that everything was ready. He placed his hand on the lever. No countdown, no ceremony. He just pulled it. The trapdoor opened. Hans Frank dropped 8 feet. The rope snapped taut. His body jerked violently, then hung there, swaying slightly. But he didn't die instantly. The witnesses could see his body convulsing. His legs kicked against the restraints. The drop hadn't broken his neck cleanly. He was strangling, dying slowly. The prison doctor started timing. Protocol required confirmation of death. 1 minute passed. Hans Frank was still moving. His body twisted on the rope, fighting for air that would never come. His brain was being starved of oxygen. Every second was agony. 2 minutes. The movements were weaker now, but still present. His cultured mind, his brilliant legal intellect, was shutting down neuron by neuron. 3 minutes. The convulsions had mostly stopped, just occasional twitches. His body turned slowly on the rope, a grotesque pendulum. 11 minutes. The doctor finally approached. He checked for a pulse at the wrist, at the neck. Nothing. He listened for a heartbeat. Silence. Hans Frank was dead. The body was cut down and placed in a coffin. The doctor noted the cause of death as judicial hanging. There was bruising around the neck, consistent with strangulation. The execution had taken longer than standard. Whether by design or accident, Hans Frank had suffered in his final moments. His body was photographed for the record. The face was swollen, discolored. Nothing remained of the cultured lawyer who'd loved Chopin. Just a corpse, one of 10 that night. The bodies were loaded into trucks and driven to a crematorium in Munich. They were burned together, the ashes mixed so no individual remains could be identified. Then the ashes were scattered in a river. No grave, no marker, no memorial. Hans Frank simply ceased to exist, but his crimes lived on. The diary he'd kept so carefully became evidence of the Holocaust. Historians used it to document the systematic murder of millions. His own words condemned him for eternity. He'd wanted to be remembered as an important historical figure. He got his wish, just not the way he'd imagined. He's remembered as the Butcher of Poland, as one of the architects of genocide, as proof that education and culture are no defense against evil. The survivors of his rule never forgot him. Polish Jews who'd escaped the death camps, Polish resistance fighters who'd battled his regime, ordinary Poles who'd suffered under his administration. They carried his memory as a warning. This is what happens when power is given to someone without conscience. This is what happens when law becomes a weapon. This is what happens when a cultured man decides that some lives don't matter. Hans Frank's execution brought no one back from the dead. It didn't rebuild the destroyed communities. It didn't restore the stolen years. But it did one thing. It proved that even the most powerful criminals eventually face justice. It may take time. The wheels of justice may turn slowly. But they turn. And maybe that's the only comfort we can take from stories like this. That monsters can be stopped, that crimes can be punished, that the arc of history, however slowly, bends toward accountability. Hans Frank spent his final days claiming he'd found redemption through God. Maybe he believed it. Maybe it was genuine repentance. Or maybe it was just another performance from a man who'd spent his life manipulating others. We'll never know what was truly in his heart as the rope tightened and the darkness closed in. But we know what he did. We know the millions who died because of his orders. We know the suffering he caused, the families destroyed, the culture erased. And we know that in the end, he paid for it with his life. The lesson of Hans Frank isn't just about the Holocaust. It's about the corruption of power, about how easily educated people can rationalize evil, about how culture and brutality can coexist in the same person. He proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like lawyers and administrators. Sometimes they quote Shakespeare and play Chopin. Sometimes they use legal language and bureaucratic procedures to commit genocide. This is why we must remain vigilant, why we must question authority, why we must never assume that education or culture automatically makes someone moral. Hans Frank had every advantage, every opportunity to be a force for good. He chose evil instead. He chose power over justice, brutality over mercy, genocide over humanity. And he made those choices every single day for 6 years, signing death warrants from a castle, sending millions to their deaths while listening to classical music. The Nuremberg trials established a principle that still matters today, that following orders is not a defense for crimes against humanity, that individuals are responsible for their actions, no matter what authority commanded them, that there are some lines that cannot be crossed, some crimes that cannot be excused. Hans Frank tried to hide behind his position, behind Hitler's authority, behind the chaos of war. The judges rejected every excuse. They held him accountable for what he'd done, and they sentenced him to death. On that cold October night in 1946, justice was served. Imperfect justice, delayed justice, but justice nonetheless. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, the cultured lawyer who'd orchestrated genocide, died on a gallows in Nuremberg. His last words were a prayer for mercy. But mercy was something he'd never shown his victims. Mercy was something he'd systematically denied to millions of people. And in the end, mercy was something he didn't receive. The rope tightened. The trapdoor opened. And Hans Frank fell into history as one of its greatest monsters. His execution didn't heal the wounds he'd caused, but it closed a chapter. It proved that even in the darkest times, even when evil seems to have won completely, justice eventually arrives. It may be slow, it may be imperfect, but it comes, and when it does, it's final. Hans Frank learned that lesson in his last moments, as the rope cut off his air and his brilliant mind went dark forever. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It's just justice taking its time. And for Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, time finally ran out on October 16th, 1946, in a cold gymnasium in Nuremberg, at the end of a rope.